Do you ever get confused about how to think about or talk about differences between men and women? Between the different messages that you see in the media, conversations with different friends, or social media? Oh no. Look, I'm not going to solve that problem for you right now, but I am, for my year of living manly, in a position where I'm going to have to describe and hopefully help us out a little bit about how to think about differences between men and women, because that's going to be crucial to my whole project. First, welcome back to Living Manly. It's day 3 of 2022, and I happen to have a day off, so I'm using it to insert a quick, but I believe necessary bit of context for this year's project. So a reminder, I'm embarking on a 1-year project to be more masculine. But masculine according to whose definition? This is going to be critical. According to facts that I collected in a survey of over 1,500 men and women in the U.S. of March last year, of those men who comprised roughly half of the survey, 41% of them strongly agree that they consider themselves very masculine. Now, I've spent months analyzing these men. I'm very intrigued by them. As I've written before, they're some of the best men we have among us. And as I've admitted before, I am not one of them, or have tried not to be, partly because I have misunderstood the spectrum along which men and women find themselves. So the purpose of this short video is to use my survey data to illustrate a couple of things and to show you how I intend to be guided by my data throughout this project. So even when I go beyond the data in my efforts to cultivate greater masculinity in my own life, it is all built on this foundation of data and analysis. Now, when I bring up the differences between men and women, I am using the word differences in the plural for good reason. So, because there is no single difference that explains how we experience being men or women in the world. Yes, the Y chromosome forms the biological basis for being a man, but it's not a single driver. And what I mean by that is it's not in total control, and it has to interact with other genes, millions of them, on other chromosomes to do its many jobs. So along the way, it is subject to a lot of environmental influences, and those environmental influences begin all the way back to the time when the fetus is in utero, under the influence of the mother's body. The hormones she generates, the stresses she experiences, all of the environment that she's able to provide for the child. And that continues all the way through that period into the child's birth and arrival into a development as a child and then a teenager and into adulthood. So a male fetus is born male, but becoming a masculine man, as I'm going to describe it here, is dependent on many, many factors that aren't just, many of them are just not part of the scope that I'm going to cover here. So I'll leave those to one side. I will put in a few links below to kind of a reading list of excellent general reading material that you might consider if you want to dive deeper into the biology and the sociology of what would make a man emerge to be more masculine, okay? For now, suffice it to say that there are probably a million different influences that shape the degree to which a young boy will grow up to perceive himself as masculine. The same will be true of a young girl and her ultimate sense of both masculinity and femininity. Now, as I have hinted before, the influences that made me comfortably seek to not be very masculine in my own life were both biological. I just wasn't that muscular, and let's admit it, very coordinated as a kid, but also sociological. So I remember growing up in the 70s into the 80s, watching shows like Three's Company or Rocky, later Rambo, and decided that, well, if I had to choose, being more like Jack from Three's Company. And let's think about who he is. He's a somewhat wimpy, but kind and sensitive guy who, by the way, was surrounded by beautiful women. That was more to my liking, instead of hewing toward Rocky Balboa, Adrian, an admittedly strong guy, but a little dim. And it was kind to his plain wife, but they didn't have the kind of engaging and energetic relationship that I imagined I would one day have with my own wife. So I hope to make it clear in my project, but the idea that I had to choose between Jack and Rocky, that was my original mistake. That's the root of the problem here. And as I'll describe, it's not only borne out by the data that I will share with you in these periodic videos when I have time to make them, but when we talk about the differences between men and women, I have to insert this warning that when I find differences between men and women, I'm more interested in whether those differences persist and even expand when we're looking at the men who consider themselves very masculine, or whether, spoiler alert, in many cases, the most masculine men among us for key dimensions actually look, in the data, more like the average woman. Another warning, I'm going to talk a lot about averages. My fellow nerds will know what that means. We either get it or we learned it. But when I say the average man compared with the average woman, data people know exactly what I mean. But here's why I need the warning. Most people are not data people. No shame, no harm. So when I say the average woman says this about her experience, and you reply with, but I'm a woman and that's not my experience, or maybe somewhat less validly, I know women for whom that's not true, you are not capturing the point of dealing with averages. So I think later on, I'll probably do an in-depth discussion about what it means to compare two groups by looking at averages. But for now, I'm just going to ask you to do two trusting things. Number one, trust that I only approach this with goodwill. Goodwill for my own outcomes and for yours. That's first. Because if you believe, as so many do in these kind of digital social media interactions, that I'm here to try to persuade you, to change you, to manipulate you, then it doesn't matter what data I share with you. We're not gonna see eye to eye. If, however, you're willing to say, okay, I trust that he's not trying to manipulate me. Let me see where he's going to take this. Then the second thing I'd ask you to do is just be willing to let me do the thing that I have been paid my whole career to do, which is to interpret data. Now, hopefully this small exercise we're about to do together will demonstrate both my goodwill and my analytical approach, and hopefully to your satisfaction. First graphic. Let's jump right in. All right, take a look at this one. I asked the men and women in my survey to respond to this question. So, do you currently have a healthy weight? I asked them to answer on a scale from 1 to 5. You're going to see a lot of these scales in my analysis where 1 is very unhealthy and 5 is very healthy. Here are the responses for women and men combined. Now, you can see that it leans or it skews to the right, which just simply means that more than half of people lined up, in this case 54%, if you add those 4 and 5 buckets up, that they are saying that they have a healthy or a very healthy weight, one or the other. Now, if we put up just women's responses to this, let's see how that changes. It doesn't change the overall shape, you see. It still leans right, but it centers a little bit more. It comes back more toward the middle. So we're looking at, if we add up the people, the 26% and the 19%, we get to 45%. So just under half of women who think they have a healthy or a very healthy weight. Now, if I compute the average of this, the average of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, we end up with a 3.3. That means really nothing in the real world, and it's not a useful piece of information except if we hold on to it, because I'm going to come back to it in a little bit and compare that number to men. So visually, let's see how men responded to this question. So men lean way more to the right. 28% very healthy, 38% healthy. Add those up really quickly, you get 66%, or almost perfectly 2/3 of men who are out there saying, yeah, I have a healthy or a very healthy weight currently. Now, this is just a very simple example of a statistically meaningful difference between men and women. I will resist inserting a lot of statistical significance talk in these videos, but I got to start up front just so that you understand that I know what I'm doing. The men's average here, remember, for women it was 3.3, for men it's 3.8. That difference, the center point of the male distribution, 3.8 and 3.3 for women, that difference, that's half of a point. On a scale of 1 to 5, half of a point is meaningful. And in fact, I ran a t-test on it, for those of you nerdy enough to know what that is, and it is in fact statistically significant. To the 0.01 level. So that means that we have 99% confidence that this difference in how men and women perceive whether their weight is healthy or not is probably real, not just an artifact of the way I've surveyed. Okay, but what difference am I really talking about? And this is very important. Because note that I didn't ask them what their weight actually was. I didn't ask them to divulge to me or get on a scale, tell me their weight, their whatever. I didn't even define healthy weight. I just asked them whether or not they thought their weight was healthy. Now, we know from the CDC and the National Institutes of Health that about 42% of U.S. men and women both are what we would call obese, defined by a BMI, a body mass index of 30 or higher. Now, I'm not going to get into whether BMIs are a good thing. There's some horrible problems with them from a measurement perspective, but we do know that the higher it goes, the more likely it is that you're going to have health troubles that are related to your weight, not necessarily caused by all that. All those disclaimers, fine. But this is true. So higher incidence of diabetes, heart disease, stroke, when you cross the obesity line, not to mention a higher risk of long-term health issues and even mortality from COVID, which we've sadly had to learn over the last 2 years. So now I bring all that up to make sure you understand how this whole project is going to be colored by this fact. And this is important. Respondents don't always know how to precisely respond or measure the thing you're asking them to describe. Now, or if they do know, their willingness to tell me, because they don't have to be honest, in a truthful way, that's an open question. And this is, for those of us who survey, this is stuff we deal with all the time. We know how to triangulate between multiple questions to try to figure out what's going on, what are people saying, what do people really think versus what they're saying, all of that stuff. But basically, both men and women suffer from similar rates of obesity according to the CDC and the NIH. So if people were answering from an actual understanding of the rate of the weight's contribution or obesity's contribution to health outcomes, these numbers would all be lower. They'd be lower for men and they'd be lower for women. So fewer people should have agreed that they have a healthy or a very healthy weight. So what can we say about this difference between men and women then? So you could argue that men are just bigger liars than women, that they are motivated to pretend that they are awesome, invincible, and so on, to impress people. Or that maybe they have been told and raised from boyhood to pretend to be invincible in the kind of don't cry mode. Or they could just be biologically less sensitive to risk. Now, some amount of all of these things could be at play differently for each man. This is why this is tricky. I'm going to talk about averages and groups, but it plays out differently. All of these influences will play out differently depending on who we're talking about and where they are in their life at this moment. But if we go back and look at this data, that's why I've kept it up all this time, the difference isn't huge. I mean, so if you want to say, James, you're hiding from the fact that all men are liars, you can say that, but they aren't lying a lot more than women are. Or it's only some of them who are lying a lot more than women and other men are. Now, if you want to believe that they're just hiding their vulnerabilities, same thing applies. A third of men admit that their weight isn't healthy. So this learning not to be vulnerable didn't actually work then for some of those men. It doesn't apply to all of them either. Even the biological predisposition to take risks, something I'm going to talk a lot about this year because this turns out to be huge. It doesn't apply to all men, yet it does apply to some women. So you can see, I'm going to talk about differences all throughout this project, and I'm going to talk about them in broad strokes. But I know, and you should know, that there is this level of complexity going on underneath here. We have slightly different, generally overlapping populations between men and women who are manifesting differently for reasons that could be intrinsic to who they are, that could be a function of the way they were raised, the way they think they should answer a question. That and all of that needs to be part of how you walk with me through this project this year. That's the kind of analysis that I'm doing behind the scenes on everything. I won't be this explicit each time. I know, you're welcome. But I do this to help you not fall into the trap of thinking that I'm missing one weird trick that would turn my analysis upside down. Instead, if you see something that you want me to explore in more depth, chances are good I've already done so. And if I haven't, chances are very good I'm willing to. So we can engage each other on these kinds of questions. I already have people reaching out from the first video saying, what about this and what about that? Love it. Now, I recognize, however, that I am posting this on the internet. The center of gravity of humane and kind and intellectually stimulating conversation. Okay. So I understand that I'm going to have some people who get upset by what they think I'm saying or just reject the data outright. I will tend not to engage with those people. I'm not a source of hot takes on sex and gender. Not even close. I'm just a guy on a mission trying to figure out what it means to be more fully masculine, a 5 out of 5 on my scale. So I can see what I've possibly been missing all these years and what I could yet add in the decades I have ahead of me. Now, I'm working the rest of this week, so I hope to have another post up on Saturday. And in that one, I will share some counterintuitive results to this question. Ready? How much do you agree that this word describes you? The word is emotional. I'll use this question to talk more about the differences between men and women, but more importantly, I'll start to introduce the conversation where I specifically separate out very masculine men from other men as well as women and compare them. I think this question about how emotional men see themselves, it's going to surprise you. And the masculine results are going to surprise you even more. Until then, feel free to subscribe below, follow the links below to learn more. Also, you're welcome to go to my Substack where I'll generally post more detailed information, and you can subscribe there as well. I look forward to this project with you. Let's see where we go from here.